So now what I want to do is talk a little bit about the distinction between facts versus truth on the one hand, and facts versus feelings on the other hand. I want to kind of get clear about what exactly we mean when we're using these words, because I think oftentimes things like facts and truth, for instance, can be conflated. We oftentimes just think they're the same sort of thing. So I want to spend a little time digging into these concepts, these terms, to make sure that it's clear exactly what it is we're talking about. And then spend a little time talking about feelings and why feelings really aren't the right sort of thing that we can use as evidence in support of different claims or propositions when we're evaluating arguments. That's not to say feelings don't matter, right? Feelings do matter. They have an important role to play, but we need to be careful with the way we're utilizing these notions. So let's start by talking about facts versus truth. All right, so I want to give an example. An example I remember when I was an undergraduate that I think will help sort of spell out what we're talking about here. This happened to me when I was in biology, introduction to biology, many, many years ago. And I remember the professor saying, you know, Christopher, there really are no facts in science, right? There's no facts in biology. And I remember thinking, that's really strange. I mean, I was sitting in a biology class, I was preparing for an exam, and here's the professor telling me there are no facts in biology, there's no facts in science. That just didn't make any sense to me. Now, my biology professor was not saying, that everything's subjective or that there's no, fundamental truth out there to be gleaned or to discover. Rather, what he was saying is truth applies to statements or to claims, right? Truth applies to statements or to claims. These are the things that are truth at. Statements and claims are the sort of things that can be true or false, right? That's what we talked about previously. Whereas the facts, this is really the empirical data or the observations that we make, the information that we gather, right? So that's the stuff the world provides, right? And then we use that stuff, these facts out there, and we try to apply it to figure out whether or not these statements are true or false. So a classic example of this would be something like the claim, snow is white, right? That statement, that claim, is either going to be true or false. So what do? We go out in the world, we try to determine whether or not it really is the case that snow is white, right? What does the facts tell us? What data do we have? What observations can we make, right? So snow is white will be true, is true, if and only if it really is the case that snow is white. Right, so that's one way kind of thinking about how we're using these terms, facts versus truth, right? It's not to say that there are no absolute truths out there in the world to be discovered, right? When we say there are no facts in biology, all we're saying is that we have to allow for the possibility that future information might change what we think about the truth value for particular statements, right? If it turns out that future information, future observations that we make tells us that snow is actually green rather than white, well, then we would need to change what we believe, what our theory is about snow in general. Of course, this is just a toy example. I'm not trying to suggest that we're ever going to get some observation that tells us snow is actually green instead of white, but this is just supposed to help illustrate this idea. And I think it's helpful to actually pay attention to what exactly a scientific theory is, right? A scientific theory is actually a long string of different statements. These are different statements that are conjoined together. So let's think about what a scientific theory actually is. We'll just call this theory T, right? So that theory is going to be the conjunction of different statements. Statement 1, and statement 2, and statement 3, and statement 4, and however many statements we've got in the theory. There could be hundreds or thousands of statements, or maybe it's just a conjunction of 5 or 6 statements. Either way, the theory itself literally is just the conjunction of a whole bunch of statements, right? A whole long string of statements. And so when we go out and make observations, we collect data, right? We try to understand what the world is actually like, then we can use those, right, those data points or those observations as facts that determine whether or not these statements turn out to be true or false. Because remember, statements or claims are truth apt. Facts really aren't. Facts are just the raw data that's out there in the world that we're trying to collect and understand in order to make sense of the statements that comprise the theory. So if we think that statement 2 is true, and then we go and we collect some new data, that information, those facts actually tell us, oh, look, statement 2 is false, right? Then we should reject that statement. And we should amend it, right? We should update our beliefs about it. And that means that perhaps we would have to make alterations or changes or slight adjustments to what the theory actually says. For instance, let's consider another statement. A statement that I think we'll all agree is true. Let's consider the statement, Obama is a father. Right? Well, we believe this is true. Presumably you believe this is true because we have evidence, right? We make observations. We can go out there and look at what the world is like, and we can see, hey, look, President Obama has 2 daughters. So that means that this statement has a truth value of true. Now, what about the statement, Obama is a bachelor? Right? Notice that bachelor just means unmarried man. Right? Well, so when we go out and we make observations, we collect some data, we get the facts, and we notice that, look, Obama's married to Michelle Obama. So that means that this statement would be false. Right? In fact, we can actually amend this statement to say it is not the case that Obama is a bachelor. And once we add this part here, it is not the case, well, now we can say that this statement is true, right? Because it's literally the negation of this one here. Right? So that's the way that we're using this distinction between facts and truth, right? Truth applies to statements. Statements are truth apt, so that means they're either going to be true or false. Whereas facts is the information that we collect, the raw data that the world provides, that we try to use to determine whether the statements are true or false. But again, we've always got to allow for the possibility that in the future, we might collect new data, contravening evidence that might suggest we need to update or change our beliefs or the statements that comprise a theory. So that's the basic gist between these notions of facts and truth. Now what I want to do is turn to a different distinction between facts and feelings. One of the reasons why we want to pay attention to the distinction between facts and feelings is because feelings aren't the sort of thing that we can use to provide support for different statements or claims. Right? So we've got facts versus feelings. Again, the facts are going to be the raw data out there in the world, what we might call the evidence that we're using to determine or make judgments about whether some statement is true or false. So let me say a little bit more then about evidence. What is evidence? Evidence, for our purpose, is going to be anything that makes it the case that some statement or claim or proposition is likely to be true. Right? Evidence for our purposes is going to be literally anything at all. Anything that we might observe or collect, or information that we go out and discover, whatever the world provides us, right? Anything that's going to make it the case that some particular statement or claim or proposition actually is more likely to be true, right? So when we are thinking about the statement snow is white, we go out there and we look to see whether it really is the case that snow is white. We use those observations because it makes it the case that the statement snow is white is more likely to be true. Right, so that's what we mean here by evidence, right? So that's how that applies to facts. But what about feelings? Let me give you another sort of example to help think about this. Consider an argument that says something like, X is the case, right? Whatever X is, could be anything. And then our second premise would say, if X is the case, then that makes me sad and angry. Right? It might be true that whatever X is happens to make you sad. It happens to make you really angry and upset. But we can't use that to derive any sort of conclusion, right? It would be problematic to then argue, based on these two premises, that therefore X is not the case, right? That would be a bad argument. The mere fact that something happens to make you upset or angry does not make that thing false or wrong or immoral or whatever, right? So let's spell this out in terms of an actual example. Let's plug something in for X here. All right, so let's suppose then that we're thinking of the Supreme Court ruling that made gay marriage legal. Right? So that'll be our first premise. It'll say basically that the Supreme Court ruled in favor of gay marriage. Right? That's just a factual statement, right? We can go out there and make observations and determine that is really the case. That did occur in the United States, right? So then we can introduce the second premise that involves our feelings, right? But if that's true, then it makes me feel sad and angry. Right? I might actually feel sad and angry and upset because of what the Supreme Court ruled regarding gay marriage. But it doesn't follow from the fact that I've got those feelings that what they ruled was incorrect or that what they ruled was false. Right? So we cannot infer, therefore, the Supreme Court of the United States made a mistake. I mean, maybe you think that they did make a mistake, but if they did, it's not because it made you sad or it's not because it made you angry, right? That is not relevant. It's a fallacy of relevancy, right? Introducing something about how you feel with regard to the Supreme Court ruling does not give us any reason to think that what they ruled was incorrect or problematic, right? So we can't use our feelings in support of this conclusion because our feelings are not the sort of thing that can be either true or false. It can be true or false that you feel sad, but the feelings themselves are not the sort of thing that can be either true or false.